January 25th, 2023. The snow crunched beneath my boots as we trudged up the final stretch toward the cabin. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches creak like ancient bones. The cabin stood isolated at the top of Whispering Mountain, its wooden frame barely visible through the thickening snowfall. My breath came in sharp, frosty bursts, each exhale mingling with the tense atmosphere that had settled over us since we arrived. Inside, the cabin was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The crackling fire in the stone hearth cast flickering shadows on the wooden walls, but even the warmth couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. My friends laughed and unpacked, oblivious to the shiver that ran down my spine as I glimpsed something outside the window. A shadow? I blinked, but it was gone, swallowed by the darkening forest. The evening wore on, and the wind picked up, howling like a lost soul outside. My unease deepened as I heard faint scratching on the window behind me. I turned, but there was nothing, just the skeletal branches tapping against the glass. My friends, engrossed in their conversation, paid no mind to my growing discomfort. I tried to join in, but the cabin felt smaller, more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in. By the time night fell, a full-blown storm had descended on the mountain, trapping us in the cabin. The wind rattled the windows, and the once cozy fire now seemed sinister, its shadows dancing eerily across the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something out there knew we were here. My heart raced when I caught a glimpse of a face pressed against the window, pale and lifeless. I gasped, but when I looked again, it was gone, leaving me questioning my sanity. I tried to tell the others, but they dismissed it as my imagination running wild. Yet the fear was real, tightening its grip on me as the storm raged on. I lay awake in my bed, listening to the howling wind and the scratching branches, praying that whatever was out there would leave us alone. But deep down, I knew the night was far from over. The morning light barely penetrated the heavy clouds as we gathered around the table, nursing cups of coffee. My friends seemed unaffected by the events of the previous night, laughing and planning a hike through the snow-covered forest. But I couldn't shake the lingering fear. The face I'd seen at the window haunted me, its pale features etched into my mind. As we prepared to leave, I hesitated at the door, the cold air biting at my face. My friends teased me for being nervous, but something deep inside told me not to go. Still, I couldn't stay behind alone, so I followed them into the woods, every step filling me with dread. The snow crunched underfoot, and the trees loomed above us like silent sentinels, their branches weighed down by the snow. We hadn't gone far when I started hearing it again. Faint whispers carried by the wind just beyond the edge of hearing. I glanced around, but my friends seemed oblivious, laughing and chatting as if nothing was wrong. The whispers grew louder, blending with the wind's howl, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Something was out there, watching us, waiting. As we ventured deeper into the forest, we came across strange symbols carved into the trees, symbols that seemed ancient and foreboding. My heart raced as I reached out to touch one, its grooves rough and cold against my fingers. I pulled back, suddenly feeling as if the forest itself was alive, its very essence infused with something dark and malevolent. My friends shrugged it off as some old markings from long-forgotten hunters, but I knew better. These symbols were a warning, a sign that we weren't welcome here. The further we walked, the stronger the feeling grew. It was as if the forest was closing in on us, the trees growing closer together, their branches intertwining like a web. I felt trapped, suffocated by the overwhelming sense of dread. I tried to convince the others to turn back, but they insisted on pressing on, eager to explore the abandoned campsite we'd heard about. Reluctantly, I followed, my every instinct screaming at me to run. When we finally reached the campsite, the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The remnants of an old fire pit and a few decaying tents were all that remained, but the place felt wrong, as if it was frozen in time. I could almost hear the echoes of voices long gone, the crackle of a fire that had long since burned out. My fear turned to terror as I noticed fresh footprints in the snow, too fresh to have been left by the previous campers. Something had been here recently, and it was still close. The night after our unsettling discovery at the campsite was a restless one. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin felt like a prison, its wooden walls closing in on me as the wind howled outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line, that by venturing into the forest, we had awakened something ancient and malevolent. Sleep was elusive, every creak of the cabin sending a jolt of fear through me. When I finally drifted off, the nightmares came. They were vivid, disturbingly real, pulling me into a dark, twisted version of the cabin. In my dream, I was alone, surrounded by shadows that whispered my name. I could feel their icy breath on my neck, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows closed in, their whispers growing louder, until I was consumed by darkness. I awoke with a start, my body drenched in sweat, the echoes of the whispers still ringing in my ears. The room was freezing, the fire long extinguished, leaving the cabin shrouded in darkness. My heart raced as I realized I wasn't alone. At the foot of my bed, a figure stood, its pale face illuminated by the faint moonlight seeping through the window. It was the same face I had seen outside the night before, lifeless and cold. I froze, too terrified to move, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. My pulse thundered in my ears as I sat up, trying to calm the rising panic. I knew I had to tell the others, but when I finally gathered the courage to wake them, they dismissed my fears as just another bad dream. They didn't see what I saw, didn't feel the terror that gripped me. But I knew what I had experienced was real, and the fear gnawed at me like a festering wound. The next morning, the tension was palpable. My friends tried to laugh it off, but I could see the unease in their eyes. The carefree atmosphere from the day before had vanished, replaced by a heavy sense of dread. I could tell they were beginning to believe me, though they were too proud to admit it. As we gathered for breakfast, the cabin seemed darker, the walls closing in like a cage. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped by the fear that had taken root deep within me. Later that day, as I was searching through the cabin for something to distract myself, I stumbled upon an old, dust-covered journal hidden in the back of a closet. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pages yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The entries were dated decades ago, written by someone who had stayed in the cabin before us. As I read, my blood ran cold. The author described the same strange occurrences: scratching at the windows, shadows in the woods, and the face that appeared at night. They wrote of a presence that grew stronger each day until one night it consumed them completely. The final entry was unfinished, the last words trailing off into a smudge of ink. The discovery of the journal left me shaken, but it also confirmed what I had feared. Something terrible had happened in this cabin before, and we were next. I shared the journal with my friends, watching as their faces paled with each passing word. The carefree laughter that had filled the cabin just a day ago was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. They couldn't deny the truth any longer. We were not alone, and whatever was haunting this place had unfinished business. As the day wore on, the tension escalated. The shadows in the cabin grew longer, the cold seeping into our bones despite the roaring fire. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside set us on edge. We tried to distract ourselves, to pretend that everything was normal, but it was futile. The presence in the cabin was growing stronger, feeding off our fear, and we were powerless to stop it. It was Emily who first suggested that we needed to leave. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her usual bravado gone. But the storm outside raged on, making any attempt to escape impossible. We were trapped, with no choice but to confront whatever it was that haunted us. As night fell, the atmosphere in the cabin became suffocating, the air thick with a malevolent energy that made it hard to breathe. Desperation set in as we huddled together, trying to come up with a plan. The journal had mentioned a ritual, a way to appease the spirits and break the curse. It was our only hope, but none of us knew if it would work or what the cost might be. We gathered the items the journal described: candles, salt, and an old rusted key that had been hidden beneath the floorboards. The cabin seemed to pulse with energy as we prepared, the walls closing in as if the very building was alive, watching us. The wind outside howled like a chorus of tormented souls as we began the ritual. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I could feel the presence growing, pressing down on us, cold and menacing. We formed a circle, holding hands, and recited the words from the journal, our voices shaking. The room seemed to close in, the temperature plummeting as the ritual reached its peak. The fire in the hearth flared violently, then extinguished, plunging us into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and oppressive. Then, the ground beneath us began to tremble, and the cabin shook as if gripped by an unseen force. The walls creaked and groaned, and I felt a surge of panic. The presence was here, and it was angry. The temperature dropped further, our breath visible in the frigid air. I could barely see my friends, their faces pale and terrified in the dim candlelight. The cabin felt like it was on the verge of collapse, the walls trembling as the malevolent force grew stronger. The shadows twisted and stretched, reaching out as if trying to pull us into the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands slick with sweat as I clutched the old key, the final piece of the ritual. My friends' faces were masks of fear, their eyes wide and unblinking as they recited the ancient words, their voices trembling. As I placed the key in the center of the circle, a sudden gust of icy wind blew through the cabin, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into total darkness. The only sound was the frantic beating of my heart, and for a moment, I was certain we had failed. Then, from the depths of the darkness, a low, mournful wail rose up, echoing through the cabin like the cry of a lost soul. The temperature dropped further, the air so cold it burned my lungs with each breath. The shadows around us seemed to convulse, retreating into the corners of the room, as if they were being drawn away by an unseen force. The cabin groaned, the wood creaking as the presence that had tormented us began to dissipate. I could feel the weight lifting, the oppressive atmosphere slowly fading as the ritual took hold. The ground beneath us stopped trembling, and the cabin grew still, the malevolent energy that had filled it finally beginning to ebb away. For a moment, there was silence. Then a faint glow appeared in the center of the circle where the key lay. It was small at first, just a pinprick of light, but it grew brighter, illuminating the room with a warm golden hue. The shadows recoiled from the light, retreating further until they were nothing more than faint outlines. The warmth spread through the cabin, driving out the cold, and with it, the fear that had gripped us. The oppressive force that had haunted us was gone, replaced by a peaceful stillness. The cabin seemed to exhale, the walls no longer closing in. The oppressive weight lifted. I looked at my friends, relief washing over me as I saw the fear slowly draining from their faces. We had done it. The spirits were gone, freed from whatever had bound them to this place. The fire in the hearth roared back to life, filling the room with a comforting warmth. For the first time since we arrived, I felt safe, as if the cabin was no longer a prison, but a sanctuary. As dawn broke, we gathered our belongings, eager to leave the cabin behind. The storm had passed, the morning light shining through the windows, illuminating the snow-covered landscape outside. We stepped out into the crisp air, the sense of dread that had weighed on us finally gone. The mountain was silent, peaceful, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath our boots as we made our way down the trail. I glanced back at the cabin one last time, feeling a strange sense of closure. The nightmare was over. 22. The tires crunched on the gravel as I pulled up to the cabin, the sound echoing through the quiet mountains. The isolation was exactly what I needed. Time alone to clear my head after everything that had happened. The breakup had left me feeling hollow, and the city was suffocating. This cabin, hidden away in the depths of the woods, promised solitude. But as I stepped out of the car and looked around, a strange feeling crept over me, like a memory just out of reach. The cabin was old, its wooden frame weathered by years of harsh winters and scorching summers. It stood alone, surrounded by a dense forest of towering pines, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. As I approached, I noticed something odd, a sense of familiarity, as if I had been here before. But that was impossible. I had never set foot in these mountains, let alone this cabin. I shook off the feeling and pushed open the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the cabin was modest, a single room with a small kitchen, a bed, and a fireplace. The air was stale, as if it hadn't been lived in for years, but it was warm enough, and the view from the window was breathtaking. The forest stretched out for miles, a sea of green broken only by the distant peaks of the mountains. But even as I tried to appreciate the beauty, the strange sense of déjà vu persisted, gnawing at the edges of my mind. As night fell, the cabin grew cold, the wind outside picking up and howling through the trees. I sat by the fire, trying to read, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that strange feeling. Then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it, a faint echo, almost like a voice carried on the wind. I paused, listening intently, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. I told myself it was just the wind, but the unease lingered, settling in the pit of my stomach. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would bring some peace. But as I lay there, the echoes returned, growing louder, more distinct. They were voices, but I couldn't make out the words, just the tone, familiar, yet distant, like a memory long forgotten. My heart raced as I strained to hear, but the voices seemed to slip away every time I tried to focus. The cabin felt colder, the shadows deeper, and for the first time, I wondered if coming here alone had been a mistake. The next morning, I woke up feeling disoriented, the echoes from the night before still lingering in my mind. The sun barely penetrated the dense canopy of trees surrounding the cabin, casting long shadows across the floor. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But as I made my coffee and looked out the window, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. The day passed in a blur, the hours slipping by as I explored the area around the cabin. The woods were dense, almost impenetrable in some places, and I found myself wandering aimlessly, drawn deeper into the forest. The sense of familiarity was stronger out here, almost overwhelming at times, as if I was retracing steps I had taken before. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in deepening shadows, I made my way back to the cabin. The walk back was unnerving, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig sending a jolt of fear through me. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was dark and the air was thick with tension. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and stoking the fire, but the warmth did little to ease the cold dread settling in my chest. That night, the dreams started. They were vivid, more real than any dream I'd ever had, pulling me into the past of the cabin. I saw glimpses of people I didn't recognize, but they felt strangely familiar, as if I knew them in another life. They spoke in hushed tones, their words just out of reach. And every time I tried to listen, the scene would shift, plunging me into darkness. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, the echoes of the voices still ringing in my ears, the dreams blurred with reality, the cabin around me warping in my mind as I tried to piece together what was happening. The echoes grew louder, more insistent, and I began to recognize the voices as my own, but from different moments in my life. They were fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. And the more I tried to understand them, the more they slipped away. The feeling of déjà vu was overwhelming, and I couldn't escape the sense that I had been here before, that I was reliving something from a forgotten past. The dreams continued, each one more intense and disturbing than the last. I woke each morning feeling more exhausted, the line between sleep and wakefulness blurring until I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The echoes were no longer just a nighttime occurrence. They followed me throughout the day, whispers in the wind, fragments of conversations that felt like they belonged to another life. I couldn't escape them, no matter how hard I tried. By now, I was obsessed with a locked trunk in the attic. It was as if all the answers I sought were hidden inside, just waiting for me to unlock them. I spent hours trying to break it open, using anything I could find. Tools from the cabin, even my bare hands. But the trunk remained stubbornly closed, mocking my efforts. The more I struggled with it, the more I felt its pull, as if it held some dark secret that was tied to me in ways I couldn't understand. The echoes became more than just sounds. They were memories. Memories that didn't belong to me, yet felt as if they did. I saw flashes of a life I didn't recognize. A man who looked like me, standing in the cabin's doorway, staring out into the forest with a haunted expression. He was holding something, a key maybe. The image was fleeting, but it left me with a deep sense of unease. Who was he? And why did he feel so familiar? Desperation clawed at me as I tried to make sense of it all. I was losing myself, the boundaries of my identity crumbling with each passing day. The cabin seemed to feed on my confusion, its walls closing in, the shadows growing longer and darker. I couldn't leave. Not now. Not when I was so close to uncovering the truth. But the truth was elusive, slipping through my fingers like sand. Every answer led to more questions, and the trunk remained sealed, its secrets locked away. Then, one night, as the echoes reached a fever pitch, I had a breakthrough. In a dream, I saw myself, another version of myself, standing in the attic, the key in hand, unlocking the trunk. But before I could see what was inside, I woke up with a start. The image burned into my mind. I knew what I had to do. I tore through the cabin, searching for the key, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Finally, hidden inside an old, dusty book on the shelf, I found it. A small, rusted key that fit perfectly in the trunk's lock. With trembling hands, I held the key in front of me, the weight of it heavy with the significance I had placed upon it. The echoes were deafening now, a chorus of voices whispering in my ears, urging me forward, warning me to stop. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I stood before the trunk in the attic, the key hovering just above the lock. The air around me was thick with tension, the room seeming to vibrate with an energy I couldn't explain. I inserted the key into the lock, and the echoes abruptly ceased, leaving an eerie, oppressive silence in their wake. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned the key, the mechanism inside the trunk clicking with an ominous finality. The lid creaked open, revealing its contents, or rather, what I thought were its contents. The moment I peered inside, the world around me seemed to shift. The walls of the attic warping, the floor falling away beneath my feet. The trunk was empty, but it wasn't. It was as if it held something more than physical objects, something intangible, yet overwhelmingly powerful. My head swam with disorientation as images flashed before my eyes. Memories that weren't mine, scenes of people I had never met, but all tied to this cabin, this place. The realization hit me like a wave. I was trapped in a loop, a cycle that had repeated over and over again, with different versions of myself, different lives, all converging on this one moment. I staggered back from the trunk, my mind reeling with the weight of the revelation. The voices returned, but they were different now, clearer, more distinct. They weren't just echoes of the past. They were my own thoughts, fragmented and scattered across time. I saw myself standing in this very spot, unlocking the trunk in countless different timelines, each time hoping for a different outcome, each time failing. Panic set in as the walls of the cabin seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. I was losing myself, my sense of identity slipping away as the weight of all those lives, all those failures, pressed down on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The only thing that anchored me to reality was the key in my hand, cold and solid, a reminder of the choice I had made. In a final act of desperation, I slammed the trunk shut, the echoes silencing once more. The room steadied, the walls returning to their rightful places, the shadows retreating. I stood there gasping for breath, the key still clutched tightly in my hand. The cabin was silent, the presence that had haunted me seemingly gone. But as I looked around, I knew the truth. The cycle wasn't over. It would never be over. The trunk's contents were still a mystery, and the answers I sought were just out of reach, tantalizingly close yet forever unattainable. When I finally emerged from the attic, the dawn was breaking, casting a pale light through the windows of the cabin. The silence was oppressive, the kind that filled your ears and pressed down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. I felt disconnected, as if a part of me had been left behind in that attic, trapped within the echoes and memories that weren't mine. The key was still in my hand, its cold metal biting into my palm as I made my way outside. The forest was eerily still, the trees standing like sentinels, watching my every move. The fresh snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked, each step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from the cabin, from the trunk, from whatever had been awakened within me. But the further I walked, the more I realized there was no escape. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing closer together, their branches intertwining above my head like a canopy. I wandered for hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky, but the cold remained, seeping into my bones. The echoes had returned, faint but persistent, like a low hum just below the edge of hearing. They weren't words anymore, just sounds, emotions, fragments of a life I couldn't remember. I felt them pulling me back, urging me to return to the cabin, to the trunk, to the loop I was destined to repeat. But I couldn't go back. I wouldn't. By the time I stumbled out of the woods, I was disoriented, my thoughts jumbled and confused. I found myself on a road, the sight of it unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. A car approached, and I waved it down, my movement slow and sluggish, as if I was moving through water. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stopped and rolled down the window. He asked if I was okay, his voice full of concern, but I couldn't find the words to respond. I just nodded, climbing into the passenger seat, grateful for the warmth of the car. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest, the cabin hidden somewhere within its depths. The man tried to make conversation, asking where I had come from, but I couldn't answer. My memories of the cabin were already fading, slipping away like a dream upon waking. All that remained was a vague sense of unease, a lingering dread that something had been left unfinished. I reached into my pocket and found the key still there, its cold metal a reminder of the secret I would never uncover. The man dropped me off in the nearest town, and as I walked through the streets, the world felt strange, unfamiliar, as if I was seeing it for the first time. I knew I was supposed to feel relief, but all I felt was emptiness. The echoes were gone, but their absence was almost worse, leaving me with a void that I couldn't fill. I checked into a small motel, collapsing onto the bed, exhausted beyond belief. As I drifted off to sleep, I wondered if the cycle had really ended, or if it would start again, in another place, another time. In the morning, I awoke to the sound of something sliding under the door. I sat up, my heart pounding, as I saw a small envelope lying on the floor. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and opened it to find a single key inside. It was identical to the one I had found in the cabin, its surface worn and cold. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. The cycle hadn't ended. It had only just begun.